the next one over? Yeah, that's the one. And your sound is off, right? Yeah. Okay. Test. Yeah. Well, go ahead and just do that. So now go to, no, sorry, here, the share preloaded slides. And bring the share slides up. Okay, thanks. So I can get out of this. What? We don't need it, no. Okay, we've reached the top of the hour. Welcome to the SML BOF, structured email. Hit the next slide. We all know what day and time it is here.
And you are?
So I'm Barry Liba, and
I'm Alexei Melnikov.
And we are chairing this BOF. This is a non-working group forming BOF. The idea here is to discuss the issues that we've come to talk about and see whether the IETF is the right place to do something, whether we want to proceed forward, whether what the next steps are in talking about this. Note the note well. You've seen this many times if you've been to the IETF. If not, this is your first time seeing this in its full glory. But this tells what your responsibilities are with respect to intellectual property and other things. If you have any questions, there's a list of BCPs that your lawyers can look at and that you can look at too, but not during this session, please. Let's pay attention here next. So some things to remember about how we're running the IETF meetings. We are requiring masks for this meeting. This will be revisited for the San Francisco meeting, but for now, please wear your masks when you're not actively sipping your lovely coffee from the baristas. If you are actively speaking up at the microphone, you may, at your option, remove your mask for that, but then please put it back on. And there is a special version of Meet Echo. First of all, everybody should scan the code or activate it from the agenda to bring up either the light client or the full client. If you use the full client in the room, please keep your sound off and your microphone muted to avoid nasty consequences. But there's a very handy meeting-specific version that you can use to raise your hand and that sort of thing. If you want to get in the mic queue, you need to use that to get in the mic queue so that you are interleaved with the remote participants appropriately. Don't just line up at the microphone. So yes, you have to, that puts you on the blue sheets, and I think that's it. And you can actually use that client to control your slides. If you're presenting, we can also just run your slides for you, and you could say next slide, please. So. Yes, do we have anybody willing to take notes for this? Just, we don't need a narrative script. Jim Fenton, thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Just the main things that were discussed and decided and what action items we have. So that's the end of the administrative introduction part and the note. Well, do we have any, well, let me go through the agenda and then we'll see if anybody has anything they want to change. We're going to talk about the background of what we're here to talk about and an introduction to the concepts and the issues. And then we have a couple of a more detailed presentation on ISP experiences with schema.org. And then we'll have a question and discussion period for that stuff. And then another bit on detailed issues and the PEP presentation. And then we'll have a final discussion after that, talk about what the next steps are and whether there is work to be done in the IETF and where we are going to head with that. Does anybody have anything they want to change on the agenda? Yeah. Seeing none, let's get started. And I think we are right on schedule. So Hans-Jörg. Yeah, problem statement. Please introduce yourself while we bring the slides up.
I do. So this is Hans-Jörg from Ordriga. I'm a co-proponent of this BOF together with Conny Junghans, who will be presenting later. Thanks first of all, Alexei and Barry for taking the duty of being chairs of this BOF and also for the introduction. And thanks everybody coming here to the session and joining remotely. And yeah, today we want to talk about structured email and if this is something the IETF should be working on. Next slide, please. All right, so first part, as we have seen in the agenda, will be about reiterating a little bit on the problem statement. In case you have been reading the problem statement, which was initially submitted together with the BOF. So discussions since the meantime have a little bit shaped out into more concrete directions. So don't be so surprised that not everything touched in this problem statement will necessarily be discussed today, even though, of course, you're also happy to ask questions about everything written in there or everything else beyond that which you think is related to this. Before we get into the details of email, prior discussion of the topic brought me to the point that it might make sense to have a very short introduction about what the semantic web and related concepts are. Because probably one cannot, be sure that everybody is here on the same page. So give me just a few minutes or this single slide to have a very brief introduction about what that is, because basically that's a foundational topic for what will be following in terms of email. So on the left side, you see from a technology perspective, there has been the vision of the semantic web, which Tim Berners-Lee, some couple of years, I think it was in the early 2000s, 2001, probably the famous article in Scientific American, which basically lined out a vision of making the World Wide Web, which so far was basically a human consumable medium and contained a lot of human consumable information, to turn that or to complement that by machine readable data. And this is in all shortness the vision of the semantic web, that agents or algorithms on your behalf can also make sense of what's written on websites and can do tasks for you and so on. I think even in hindsight from today's perspective, that doesn't sound so much science fiction anymore, especially when we see recent developments in like machine interaction, AI, and so on. But I think during that time, early on, it was very futuristic in many dimensions. In the years after that, in particular within the W3C, there were a lot of standards developed with respect to that. One very relevant one or core one is RDF, the Resource Description Framework. Probably also some of you might be a little bit familiar with that. It's roughly a general method for description and exchange of graph data, where you can basically do simple logical statements in a subject, predicate, object matter, like Barry Lieber is a member of the IETF, or Barry Lieber is a chair of this BOF, for instance, or Barry Lieber is currently in Yokohama. And accordingly, there is also a query language, for instance, like called Sparkle, where you could do queries on that graph data in order to find out interesting information. So in a nutshell, you can also, people which are very deep in the topic may excuse me for not being super precise here, but for the purpose of this BOF, you can think about this as kind of a decentralized web-based database, which can be assembled together from data distributed or statements made by many people and then put into certain formats that is queryable. This RDF data can either be stored into actual files. So there are file formats or MIME types for this. For instance, application RDF XML or text turtle. There is a JSON serialization called application JSON LD. So it's a JSON-based format to capture RDF. And there are also ways of, let's say, encoding or annotating RDF inline in HTML documents. This has been invented for HTML document annotations, and algorithms can basically extract from these HTML tags the RDF document. It's a little bit similar, like somebody might know microformats or something like that. So that's very, very similar and in a related problem space here. A third thing here to mention shortly is schema.org. So what is schema.org? Schema.org is what is mentioned here as a shared vocabulary. So probably I forgot to mention that in RDF, those triples or statements are URI based. So I don't say Barry necessarily, but http://ietf.org Barry Lieber in order to reference. I can also map or equate certain URIs to join distributed statements. And obviously, if everybody just would make statements based on URIs, there would be a big mess. So it makes sense to have some certain agreement on certain topics, sort of in a way the Wikipedia does for encyclopedic knowledge. And therefore, there is certain shared vocabularies or ontologies developed by various communities that can be very domain specific, like in a certain way, Dublin Core, which is used for meta annotations in websites. There is also an REF version of that. Or schema.org in this case, which is a shared vocabulary which has mainly been developed by search engine vendors like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo. I hope I didn't forget anybody. About very basic core concepts like what is a movie, what is a person, what is a restaurant, what are properties of those. And as you can see here, it's about 700 types and almost 1,500 properties. And it's in the meantime used by more than 10 million sites. And why is this so? So we get now to the right side. So basically, at some point, the big search engines decided that they need to improve search to a certain extent. So you might have noticed, for instance, in the Google search, sometimes you might get something like structured search snippets. So when you Google for a pizza service, you see the ratings, you see the telephone number, the address in a special, very structured way, I would say. Yeah, so it's not the typical search snippet, which is just a line of text. And maybe there is directly a button to call the pizza service or visit their website. And this typically will be based on schema.org annotations. So how does it work? Excuse me. So basically, the search engine vendors, in a similar fashion like they did before with Dublin Core, header tags, which were sort of a predecessor to that, tell website owners to put annotations into their particular websites and if they use schema.org for that, those search engines say like, okay, we might reuse that data in certain cases in these structured search results. So who wants to look at this, for instance, I can recommend you to go maybe to Spotify. Not making advertisement here for anything, so there are other music engines as well. And in Spotify website, if you go to a certain album or song or track, and you look into the HTML source code, you will basically find a snippet of schema.org. And this is basically how the search engines know if you search for a certain song, which URL at Spotify to display and which additional metadata. So obviously this created an incentive for a lot of people to add these things to their websites, these annotations, because basically, of course, it's not directly stated, but search engine providers somehow said this will improve your ranking probably, or it will improve the probability that people click to your website link. There is further usages which are quite related. So you might also know Facebook Open Graph or Twitter Cards. So the first one is basically the basis for the like button. If you're again on a Spotify website and click the Google like button, again, there are similar tags to those schema.org tags, which are Facebook specific. You can recognize them by the OG tag in the HTML meta header. And there is Twitter Cards. So this is a basis you might have seen in Twitter. There is a similar functionality in many instant messaging systems. If you paste in a URL, they will show you a preview image and probably also the title of the article, the link to the article, and maybe also some rating or so. So this is basically a vocabulary which Twitter provides, and if site supports that, Twitter promises to give you a nice rendering of the URL you post into Twitter. So everybody running a website who is not aware of that, that's really a cool feature. Another thing you might be aware of or not is Wikidata. So obviously everybody knows the Wikipedia. And the Wikipedia actually also contains quite a lot of knowledge. Yeah. So if you go a little bit back to Tim Berners-Lee vision, if I would have asked you like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, which popes were born in Italy between, let's say, 1200 and 1800, this would be information perfectly available in the Wikipedia, in the English Wikipedia, maybe in many further language versions of it. But it would have taken you actually quite some minutes to find that out, because there are probably in that time frame, I don't know, maybe some 100 popes, even more. And you would have being going to all of these pages of those particular people, and you would to check, okay, where was I born, and so on and so on. And after some time, you would have found out. So what does Wikidata do? Wikidata is basically the attempt to also use this kind of structured annotations in order to leverage or to make the information or knowledge in the Wikipedia machine readable. Just very shortly, how does it work? So everybody of you somehow familiar with wikis knows that if there is a page on Pope Paul II, it might just state he was born in 1600 something in square bracket Rome, square bracket, which is an internal wiki link to another wiki page. Nice thing within wikis, a URL or a link in that case to that page is not necessarily a dead link if it's or 404 if it's not yet existent, but it's actually rendered red, which means missing information. So this is a small gimmick takeaway for you here. One of the major inventions of wikis in that sense is basically that you turn something that is considered an error in HTTP protocol actually into a feature. But by that you can even also reference information by that case in that page. And what basically Wikidata or the predecessor systems of Wikidata did, they basically proposed a little bit of schema before it. So basically in terms of just writing square bracket Rome, it allows you to say born in square bracket Rome. And this born in is parsed by the wiki engine. So you won't see it as an end user, but it's basically stored into some kind of a database. And so again, you can query it nicely in the end. And so that not all editors of the Wikipedia need to write that. You might be aware there are fancy templates within the Wikipedia. So if you go to the page of Rome or to the page of Yokohama, you see there is on the right side a very nice info box. And this info box in the Wikipedia is realized based on so-called templates. So if you now start to add this markup, which I just told you in the templates, with a single click of a button, you might realize or extract the structured data for hundreds of pages that use this template as a city or as a person and so on, which actually gives you a very nice set of data extracted out of the Wikipedia. And this is a Wikidata project, so it has an open API, it has certain exports, it's JSON-LD, it's REF. You can very nicely integrate it into your applications. So everybody not aware of that, I can really recommend to have a look at it. But now we get into what this might mean for email. Next slide, please. And by the way, if there are questions on the way, if I'm too fast or if there is maybe something missing, feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to help out. So what does all that mean for email, or how we call it here, structured email? So the idea of structured email is basically somehow fulfilling that vision Tim Berners-Lee had also for email. So email still, even if it was considered dead for a couple of times, is I think still quite lively, and I guess quite some people of you are probably using it right now here in the room. Everybody of us is using it, I guess, on a daily basis still. And still, even though there is stuff like CIF filtering rules and so on, it's basically something, where you basically spend a lot of time as a human parsing that email and answering to it. You could even say email is sort of your personal API, because people write you like, please send me those slides, please upload those slides, and so on, and you have to work on that. So the question is, how could it probably be possible to make, at least in some cases, information which is stored in the email also machine readable, so that probably either your email client or other downstream tools could basically optionally help you in processing some of that information. And also, if you consider a lot of the email you get nowadays is, for instance, transactional mail, so you get flight itineraries, you get invoices, and so on and so on. This might obviously be quite helpful in order to put that probably into certain other applications, Excel sheets, I don't know. So that's basically already the point I made then. And if you look at it, so I said email is your personal API. And for many people, I think email is sort of a little bit of an old-fashioned thing to be considered. But there's quite some recent discussion, I think, in most of the internet world about the topic of data sovereignty, like getting data off the big monopolistic vendors more in the hands of users. And if you look at it from a certain perspective, email in a way, historically or still today, is actually one of the few standardized and large-scale technologies or large-scale deployed technologies, which basically bridges your private information space and your desktop, your mobile app environment in a standardized way, easily addressable with the public internet. And I think actually that is quite an interesting design feature, which is probably overlooked very often and could be leveraged much more. Next slide, please. So yeah, what could structured mail indeed, has there been structured mail actually before? And actually, yes, there is quite some historic examples already. So based on sort of the kind of definition I gave, there are actually historic examples where you can do automated stuff within your email client. Yeah? So, and many of those here in the room probably have been involved in some of these things, like calendar invites, the IMAP protocol. Yeah? So it's nothing else than a very specific schema or vocabulary in order to organize meetings. Yeah? And email clients actually implemented that. They do some magic on your behalf. They automatically add stuff into your calendar and so on. Yeah? So that's actually a very particular instance or example of a very specific case where something like structured email or email that is machine processed in that sense is successful. There is other examples like message delivery notifications in a way, or ARF, which is an example from, it's reports from spam processing. It's maybe a little bit more technical. And there are a few further of these things that have basically their own mechanisms, their own implementations in email clients, and so on. There is some vendor-specific things. So I don't know, those guys of you which have been involved with a mailing list for quite a long time, which I think are quite some people of you might remember Mayadomo email server, and they had this, or they still have, I think it's still a live product. They have a certain language where you can answer with to an email which says like, okay, somebody subscribed you to this mailing list. Please make sure double opt in. This is you. Please respond to that mail and put subscribe or unsubscribe in the top line of this mail. Yeah? So in a way, also that is quite some low-level API which helps you to have some algorithm or machine on the back end do some stuff on your behalf. Still okay here, you need to manually input it. But again, it helps you a little bit, or it helps at least the respondent of this email. There are similar things in many help desk and ticket systems, I guess probably also a lot of people are aware with. There is some domain-specific applications also on top of email. A recent example, for instance, is COI, Chat over IMAPs. It's an IETF draft, as far as I know, and Delta Chat as a related problem, which are products, which are basically instant messaging systems on top of email protocols. And finally, there is, more or less recently, or since like 10 years, there is more generic approaches. So as I said, those RFC-based vendor-specific things are always for a very particular domain, for a very particular use case. And of course, if you want to have something like, processing your invoices or something like that, going the whole way, writing an RFC, making email vendors implement that, is probably not a realistic scenario. So what some vendors actually started, and here we actually get back to schema.org, you might remember from the previous slide, is that some vendors allowed to put, in a similar fashion, you do that to websites, schema.org into emails. Yeah? And I can tell you, you probably receive those emails from time to time already. It's just your email client who is not able to parse it right now. Yeah? Because there is some documentation on it, but it's not really widely supported, but it's basically something used by very big senders and by a handful of email providers like Gmail, Yahoo, 1&1, as we will see later. And yeah, we will give a concrete example, I think, in the next slide. So yeah, how does it work? So very simple set on the sender side on top, you have your classical email, text plain, text HTML. And this is a tiny snippet of JSON LD about a flight reservation. And basically you put that into the HTML part of your email. And on the receiver side, the receiving system, for instance, can also give you a structured representation in a similar way I explained it for search. So this is a screenshot from Google, Gmail for flight itineraries. I think Google in the past also feeded this information in parts to certain apps and so on. It's a little bit tricky to track that back or replay that if it's still there or in which situations it pops up. I think in some part Google says it also might pop up in your Google search, the structured information. I have not verified if all of this is still the case, so sometimes things also change there because obviously this is also a choice on the side of the vendor in that case. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's just a more full example of this. So it's almost the entire snippet. I think you find also examples easily on the web. Probably that doesn't add too much to what I've said before. I guess hopefully the whole idea at this point is roughly clear of this concrete example. I'm just looking a little bit into the crowd. Yeah, I see. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so what's the current state of this? Yeah, so I said many of those might have a little bit of that already in their inbox. So as I said, some ESPs and larger brands do send this kind of a message. So there are a few examples here of brands that are doing it. It's obviously not easy to have a clear statistics on that. The display of this information requires with an individual's permission and application with each of the mentioned providers currently. So that's a process they enforce in part of being probably afraid of abuse or something like that. And yeah, that's basically the side here. There is some vendors that do, in addition to that, data extraction. We will probably also hear a little bit about that later. There is also some open source tools that have been written to also do data extraction on mails, which are structured, but which do not yet have these annotations inside. But in order to gain these annotations from data extraction by whatever method. On the receiving side, I told you already the list of providers. I think I missed Zoho here, but they use a very particular approach, which is using other schemas than the other three providers. Also, the schema usage on the other three providers is not super consistent, which obviously makes it a little bit difficult for senders to adopt it and to support it. And there is also some experimental open source tool implementation. So there's KDE Kmail, Nextcloud Mail, and a tool called KDE Itinerary, which we will see on the next slide. Next slide, please. So this is just a very short screenshot of an app called KDE Itinerary. So it's an open source free software. And it was basically written as a, not just as a demonstrator, but it's really a very usable tool. I can recommend it to you, especially if you do trips very often, like here to the IETF. And this app basically allows you to gather all the data you have been collecting from your travel information, like your flight, your hotel, your train, your car rental, whatever is involved in your trip. And you can basically feed this into that app by, they have a browser plugin, for instance, and within that Kmail integration, for instance, there is a button, add to KDE Itinerary. And so it sends this into that specific app, which you have installed. And then you get basically rendered. I hope one can see it a little bit here. This nice itinerary. You see there is some weather information, which they also add to this. And actually on the right side, what you see here, that seems to look a little bit confusing at the first sight. So this is basically a top level view of a train station. And there is for train stations, I think in Germany, Switzerland, I'm not 100% sure, there is an open API which basically gives you information about the status of elevators, which is actually quite a useful information for people needing assistance. And especially people in Germany might know that on train stations, there might be sometimes trouble with these kind of things. And it might be quite helpful if you do the trip to know about that. So what KDE Itinerary basically does, based on the structured information you have in the Itinerary app, it knows very well which train you're on. They're even trying to guess that if the train you're on is different from the ticket you booked, which is perfectly possible in Germany. And they basically combine this with data from this public API about elevator status. And tada, the red marked elevator is broken. So if you know you're on platform 7, you should try to get a workaround. I don't know if you can reach number 8, probably not. Yeah. So just as an example, I think this gives a small illustration. What could actually be use cases that could be enabled if this gets really widespread? So this, again, to iterate, is based on a relatively small fraction of data which is currently around. So not so many senders are currently using it in their structured email. But if many more senders would be incentivized to use it, and if many more clients would allow that to forward it to other apps or have their own functionality within that, this is something that could be possible. Next slide, please. All right, so I already mentioned implicitly some issues with schema.org for email right now, but I will sort of iterate them again in a way. I think very first thing, and this might not have been obvious from what I said so far, is that the way the schema.org for email by Gmail, Yahoo, 1&1 is currently designed is basically a sender to consumer thing. Yeah? So big senders, which need to be proven, a big sending record, which need to comply to DKIM, SPF, and so on, and which need to explicitly register and get approved by those vendors, get basically displayed and used within these vendors' email clients. Once you got these emails, it's a dead end. Yeah? I mean, you can work with the data somehow, or at least currently it's basically the tools by the vendors themselves, the closed source tools, which do work with that. Because there are not so many widely used open source tools around which you could alternatively use, because I said the support is rather experimental. And there is actually no way for you to respond to that in that way, or to send someone else such a structured message. Yeah? So I couldn't forward Braun my travel itinerary or something like that, and he would nicely see that in his Fastmail account. Yeah? Although I'm very sure he would like to probably implement that. And yeah, so then we have an issue of interoperability here, because not just the procedures are a little bit different, also the types of structured data supported are a little bit different. There is no automated way of finding out which schemas are supported with each provider. So yeah, that's not really fun if you're a sender to do that. Also, the properties might differ, which are displayed and so on. I already said the onboarding is very complex. So the registration process already told. The sender requirements with DKIM and SPF certainly make sense. However, it's quite difficult for the normal sender to figure out what goes wrong in some cases, yeah, how to get your DKIM set up right. So if you really might have played around with that, sometimes it's really difficult to find out why it currently don't work yet and what needs to be done to get it finally rendered. Those of you involved in ISPs and DKIM implementations might know there's certain different ways you can interpret it, or certain ways you can accept of that, and these might also differ. And also, it's difficult to test. Yeah, so there might be a test mode, like for instance, Google Gmail allows you to send a structured email to yourself and promises it will be rendered. Problem is, if you send to yourself in Gmail, we as a Gmail SMTP, it won't add a DKIM header. So it won't be displayed because of that then. Yeah? A nice thing it turns out, so the pro tip for everybody who wants to try it out, if you use Google Apps Script in order to do so, it will actually add DKIM headers and you can test it. Problem again, Google Apps Script has a very limited API in creating emails. So there's another thing in Google called AMP email, which we probably won't talk about so much today, which is a little bit related to this here. And this you actually can do with Google Script Console, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, Hans-Jörg, you have 3 slides after this and 3 minutes left for this section.
Perfectly fine. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, and as I said, senders need more confidence in client usage. Next slide, please. Yeah, so probably I will skip this slide at that moment because, yeah, it's actually a question coming up quite often. Why can this all be done with MIME, especially from people which have been involved in email for quite a long time? I would just save that in case this question comes up, or probably I would ask somebody to ask this question later so we can come to the slide. Next slide, please. And the same applies to where vocabularies come from. Next slide, please. All right, so my final slide here is basically now summarizing why this BOF. Yeah? So, and there is 2 answers. First answer is, I firmly believe this is a relevant extension to email. And I hope I made some point here in the past couple of minutes, which make you follow a little on this. This consists of first, it's already useful itself in its current form, and I gave you particular examples, and Connie from 1&1, one of the ISPs which are currently using it, will follow up with providing additional examples. A little bit a side topic, but in my opinion, it's actually not a small one. It's not the core topic of the BOF, but I think it's also worth consideration, is that this provides a probably reusable mechanism which can be reused in other work. So I already told you there is previous RFCs like calendar invites, message delivery notifications, and so on. All of these basically invented their own mechanism of processing within an email client. So as an email client vendor, and also as somebody sending these emails, I need to actually implement a very specific procedure within calendar invites or within MDNs. Yeah? I'm not saying you need to rewrite this by now. That's fine. That's working. It's great. But if somebody new would come up, and we will actually have a talk on that also afterwards in terms of PGP key distribution, it might be actually useful in case such structured email approach would be standardized by the IETF to basically reuse that approach also for those very specific use cases, because actually it would make the life of email client vendors easier to implement it probably. And this again would be mutually beneficial for both the cause of structured email as I presented before, and for those particular extensions. So a concrete example for an RFC I have in mind for quite a long time is actually something like a vacation notice thing. Yeah, so there is vacation notice support in Civ, but for the email client, if you receive the vacation notice, it's again something you need to manually parse. Yeah, so there is no way currently your email client knows like what does actually that person in the vacation notice say to me? Like how long away is that person? Who else should I probably contact in comparison? So you could now easily write a dedicated RFC for that, saying like, okay, this is a data format I respond, and email clients could implement that. But how many would do? Yeah, I mean, what is your experience with implementing those RFCs? On the other hand, you could basically, with what is envisioned here as structured email, you could basically implement this on top of that, yeah? And probably the likelihood of adoption would be higher. But okay. A third point, and I think also a very relevant one, is that even though the functionality I sketched so far is, I think, quite straightforward to understand, there might even be future use cases in addition to that. Yeah? So foremost, end users, enabling end users also to send such structured information to other users, which would probably in a larger scale require some additional measures here. And also more interactive and dynamic versions of email, in part going into the direction of what I mentioned already, AMP email, or there is a product by Microsoft called Actionable Messages. I won't go too much into detail here, but I think these things are inherently related in a certain way. But some of these things can only be done in a meaningful way if there is a basis for structured email. And finally, to this point, I also firmly believe that this is probably something that also could help to make to retain email relevant in today's world. Yeah, so I told you email has been considered dead for a couple of times. It's obviously not. It's a lot used for transactional email by now, but we don't know actually if this will be happen forever. Yeah? So maybe email usage will drop at a certain point, because there is then another fancy service which pops up at a certain time and consumes all the transactional emails from people. And so email usage vanishes from some time. And I think it's a question if the established infrastructure of email, the open and decentralized nature of how it works, if this isn't worth somehow being preserved also for a longer time. And if we need probably to equip email to actually keep track with some of the other tools that are around and that are being developed. Okay, and final point, I hope I'm not too far over time. Is there work required for the IETF? Yeah, and I made some examples already, so I'll keep it short, because I think, yes, it is. So several aspects in the current setup are loosely defined. It's especially difficult for long tail, small email clients to support what is currently there. I told you there's this registration processes, for instance, which big providers have. So these open source tools I mentioned to you, they will just bluntly display the schema.org in the emails right now. I'm not sure this is a good thing. Yeah, so they might need guidance on how to determine what to show and when to show. There are issues identified which may come in later slides, depending on how the discussion pursues. So some particular concrete examples, and these are actually identified from some implementation experience we did in the past and where we talked to vendors that are using this. I told you the current usage model is unidirectional, which I think is a very severe limitation because it's totally against the current idea of how email works in a decentralized way between people which can freely interact one to each other. Yeah, I think any extension or closing any of these gaps, I think it will still be possible to keep it compatible with the current providers in a way. Yeah? So it's not necessarily relevant or important if, for instance, whatever we develop here on top is directly supported by the existing vendors, which might not be easy all the time. But I think it can also be done while keeping it compatible to that. And yeah, this will conclude this first part. Probably if there are very quick questions.
Yeah, I want to take a pause here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks.
First, I want to clarify that because you've talked about extensions to email, I want to clarify that we're not talking about protocol extensions here. No
Right, yeah.
changes to SMTP or IMAP or anything like that.
Right.
This is all in processing the body of the email message.
That's a good point. Thank you. Yeah.
So beyond that comment from me, are there any clarifying questions, anything that, does anyone have anything to discuss about the problem statement briefly before we move on to the next section? Ted?
Ted Hardy, thanks very much for this presentation. I guess there are two questions that kind of came up in chat. It would be useful to get your perspective on. One was, it seems like a bunch of the stuff that currently goes on in the world doesn't actually use structured data, but uses some form of free text search and ML to determine what the actual things are. And while I see the advantage to the determinism in this, it does seem like as long as that's going on, you're going to end up with two systems, right? You're going to have the free text search and ML for anything that's unstructured, and anything that's structured is going to be a separate and probably smaller set of documents. So I'm really wondering how you're envisioning this to work in a world where both exist, because I think both would continue to exist for a fair amount of time post-specification. And the second is when we did this for search a very long time ago with SWAF template types, et cetera, trying to create structured information related to the internals of web pages, none of that actually took on because people lied. And you know, they would put things in the templates that did not actually appear in the web pages. For this case, if you're going to have things which are not displayed to the end user, that are structured data that are for processing and not actually shown to an end user, how do you deal with the potential of a sender having a mismatch between what's displayed to the end user and what's in the templates?
Very good question. Thank you very much. So first question, if I understood it correctly, so how does it relate to AI, machine learning kind of stuff? And is there actually something that needs to be maintained in parallel if this also comes into place? So I'm not, best expert probably on machine learning, but the way I understand it, this is not necessarily a binary decision in a certain way. So if you look something in hybrid AI models or something like that, I think there's also some discussion in the AI world when it comes about explanation of how an AI derives certain conclusions. You know, that's a big debate in terms of ChatGPT and so on. That actually AI methods to a certain extent also need to be complemented with structured data. So my short answer is here, I don't see there is a strict contradiction here, but these things can actually complement each other. I don't see a contradiction here. To the second point, which is basically about, okay, what is if I send something unknown, in a way? So if the sender sends something which my current client also doesn't do, I think you can compare that very easily to what we have already with MIME types and attachments. So email has this kind of extension mechanism already there. So I can send you MIME types which your email client does support and does show to you, but I can send you a Word document which actually the email client doesn't know about, or some other file format and so on. So the way it works right now, you click on it, and typically your email client will ask you, okay, this is actually a MIME type I'm not aware of. Do you want to open it with an operating system application, something like that, or do you want to install something? So I think that's actually a quite similar case. So that might also happen in this case. It's not probably necessarily something for this.
So that's actually not what I was talking about.
I'm sorry?
That's actually not a parallel to what I was talking about.
Okay, sorry.
What I was talking about was the case in which you have two different parts, one of which is shown to the end user and one of which is not, where the one that is not, and which will be processed automatically, contains data that is contrary to the one that is.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So it's processed automatically, but not reflective of what the end user sees.
Oh, okay, sorry. Thanks for the clarification.
Please keep your response brief. We're running over.
Okay, thanks. I would call this probably DC, so that shouldn't be the case. So a trusted sender probably should not do that because it doesn't make sense. So I think it's probably a matter of trust for which senders to accept that kind of information.
Can I do a random comment as well from, we already have this issue with multi-part alternative where you have text plain and text HTML, they don't have to match. One doesn't have to be derived from another. So, I mean, it's a problem potentially, but it's not new to this.
Good point.
Right, indeed, users with different clients may see different versions of the message. Braun. Briefly, please, we need to move on.
There we go. I was saying that calendar events have exactly this problem. The attached ICS file can bear no relation to the HTML that describes it. And that's a standard problem with anything. This is not making it any worse.
Okay, so thanks. Now I think Connie is up for the next section, yes?
Yes.
So Connie.
Yeah. So the audio is coming through okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so this is Connie Junghans from 1&1, which we are a mailbox provider. And I just briefly, I think I'm going to touch on some of the topics that were mentioned in the chat and in the discussion right now. And I'll just sort of try to get mailbox providers or ISPs view on this topic of structured email, structured data in email. Just one brief remark to the question before. I think it's not, but you'll see a screenshot very soon, which sort of contradicts the assumption that the structured part of the email is not shown to the user. So it's not that there's the actual email that the user sees and then the structured part is sort of hidden just for the machine. That's not the case. It's sort of both shown to the user, at least from what we have envisioned. And so sort of having these two parts contradict each other is sort of counterintuitive for the user experience. But maybe we'll go to the next slide and there's a screenshot which I'll go into and then maybe you see what I mean. I just briefly go into why we got into schema.org, or just as an example of structured data in the first place, which is, as an ISP, we sort of like, I guess email 20 years ago was very different from today. Today, for our customers at least, it's very much a B2C experience. They receive a lot of email and they send very few email, and most of the emails they receive are like machine generated. So the little picture I show here is like basically a robot writes you emails. And so there's so many emails, and Hans-Jörg touched on that before, that I guess the trend is that machines help you sort of process your emails. They're sort of do like triage or be like an assistant to help you deal with the many emails you receive. And so we sort of had like another robot in between the robot that sends the email and the human who reads the email. And so we started actually out with machine learning. So what we wanted to do is sort of help you triage your email, sort of said, okay, this is maybe a newsletter, and this is like an order email, or this is like a social media email. And we wanted to help with all these different kinds of emails, and sort of like the jobs to be done are very different for these different kinds of emails. And so we started out using machine learning to distinguish between these types of emails, and then going further into details, for example, for the order shopping emails, saying this is an order confirmation, and then the next email is like a follow-up to that, telling you something about your shipping information for the same order, and sort of grouping these two emails together. And we did all this with machine learning, which seemed really stupid after a while, because there's a robot sending emails, and then so email that's sort of made to look like a human can consume it easily, and then the robot sort of tried to parse that using machine learning. So then we went to schema.org as the structured version of that, where the computer who writes the email can tell us what like the gist of the email is. So it can use schema.org to say, okay, this is an order entity, and the order ID is like an attribute which is just like defined in a structured way, which also gives sort of the sovereignty, like it gives the sender more control over what we do, because machine learning, as we all know, is not 100% perfect. And so by giving control to the sender to tell us in a structured way what this email is about, it really helped eliminating this like uncertainty of machine learning. And the screenshot here on the right, which I tried to keep really neutral, and it's just some German test emails. It sort of shows what we envision as an example of the order emails, which is some of these elements are more colorful, they're not emails, they are like order groups. Behind them there are a lot of emails, but the order group just shows, okay, you ordered in some shop. And there's like the little icon that tells you in which step it is, if it's just ordered or on its way or already delivered. And it also shows you that it was delivered with DHL. And it's sort of during the course of your shipment, which is sort of abstract from the email, it also gives you different options to sort of like have the package be delivered somewhere else or something. And so basically that's the idea what we wanted to do with that. It's not just about order emails, but one of the examples is. And so I guess abstracting from it's a long email which really only tells you your shipment is on its way. And so by using schema.org and also sort of combining more than one email with each other, we have the ability to even give updates on shopping emails. So you have the email that's an order confirmation, but then further emails tell you that this thing has been delivered. And so the screenshot on the right shows it's an order confirmation, but the top shows actually the entire process that has already been completed. And there's also a link somewhere in there that gives you the ability to jump to other emails that are relating to the same order. But I guess for the purpose of this one, it's really only important to say having structured email in there, structured data in there really helps with just not having to go through the lengths of it. The machine learning part is actually really hard, especially in the long tail of all the email senders. And so what we started to do to actually get more traction and have senders use schema.org, because not that many senders use it yet, we developed 4 modules for shop systems that you can actually just install for free, and then it will add the structured schema.org information to all transaction emails. Because it's in the shopping, it's in the shop system anyway, right? It sends the email. And so we have these extensions for ease of adoption for smaller shops. And we were hoping that many shops use it, and then all the other senders sort of get like fear of missing out and then start adopting it as well, because they want their information to be displayed in like this, like more responsive way. But on the next slide, I'll detail a little bit of why that failed so far. There are a lot of adoption hurdles. And as Hans-Jörg mentioned as well, the most important thing is that it shouldn't be, well, not going on the text here, but the most important thing is that it shouldn't be client specific or ISP specific. It should be something that the sender can rely on, that it's done by every, or ideally rendered in a similar fashion by every client. But the first adoption hurdle is actually even knowing that structured data exists and having a big enough incentive to include it. I guess for like Google search results and stuff and web pages, the incentive is that the promise that you will be ranked better if you have structured data, which is also, I guess, part of why people are lying in the structured data. But there needs to be an incentive, and the incentive can't be like these 3 email providers out of like 100 in the whole wide world offer this thing, which is sort of similar for Gmail and for 1&1, and maybe a little bit different for Yahoo. And so the knowledge is one thing, but then also like sort of the unification, documentation, testing, it's all sort of combined. Like all these questions I listed here, a sender needs to know which mailbox provider or mailbox or mail client supports schema.org or structured data in emails, which entities are supported. I guess right now 1&1 supports different entities from Google. And so a sender has sort of 0 or very low incentive to actually include it, because they don't know what happens in the client. They also need to know what it looks like in the client, and there should be an easy way to test that before sort of like going live with all your emails. Because again, we're mostly talking about B2C email. So email is very precious. It's like marketing budget for people. And so they're very like afraid of what will happen to their email and their open rate. And so giving easy setup for testing as well, which is related to the last point of mail security, because as we all know from our personal mailbox, spammers are always the first to adopt any way to highlight an email in a mailbox. And as you saw in my screenshots, it's sort of like it's a very big highlighting and then a very big like augmentation of the actual plain email. And so we would only want to give that to legit senders and not to spam emails, which then the user would have more trust in it if we displayed sort of our like augmentation of the email content. And so we really need to take responsibility, which we do with like only doing it for DKIM signed emails. And but even beyond that, like, so there's like allow listing for like sender addresses and stuff, which is all just to sort of keep the spammers out. But again, it also makes it harder for the senders to adopt what we do. Yeah, and I think that's it on my content so far. I think I might want to touch I can touch a little bit on the machine learning and structured data coexisting, because actually it's something we do right now. We have the machine learning approach for senders who don't send schema.org email data, and we have schema.org for senders who send it. And I guess for the data model we have on our side, it's sort of unified then, like regardless of where the information comes from, for us, we store it in like a unified way. And again, going to like the sort of why would we standardize that? Imagine if we do our machine learning magic because the sender doesn't support schema.org yet, but then we could store it, like we could, whatever the outcome of our machine learning is, we could store it in a way that's then structured and can then be displayed in the same way in all the clients as if the schema.org would have been in there in the first place. That's just one of the like many ways that this can go down the road. But just to for us right now, we use both approaches to get the data and then we store it in a unified way. And I think I'm open to questions or to the next part of the
Thanks, Connie.
presentation.
This is Barry Levi. I have one thing that your shopping example brought up is the original thought of HTML and the web was that you would mark up your web page and it would be up to the web client, the browser or whatever, to lay it out, to display it, to render it. And it very quickly became clear that nobody wants that. The content creators want to control exactly what it looks like. Why would this be different? Why right now, when I shop and I get an email message from the shopping site, it's in HTML and it formats exactly the way they want it to. Why would they want to do anything different with email in the future?
Well, the email would remain untouched and still be displayed in the same way. It's more about adding another layer of extraction or sort of like the gist. Just like, I guess you still like your email about your, you booked a flight, but still you would want to have it sort of like summarized in an itinerary. So it's not, I guess we're not changing the way the email is displayed. We're just adding another layer of sort of like a meta layer, like to say these emails belong together or these emails are even shopping emails. It's not changing the emails, it's just adding, really saying the same thing 3 times over, but yeah, it's really not, so we're still displaying the email, but it's also, I guess the user wants, sometimes the user seems to want different things than the sender. I guess the sender wants you to read the entire newsletter, but the user only wants to see, okay, where's the coupon code? And so just
and
having
the sender doesn't care. The sender wants the user to see what the sender wants the user to see. And that's my skepticism about this, is that senders are not going to want to use this because they want complete control of the presentation to the user.
That's true in part, but I guess for the email, for this, even for the sender, the email is only a vehicle to, I guess they own, for example, for newsletters, they want the sale. So having the user see the entire email should only incentivize the user to buy something. But if we sort of, if we, for example, have like the coupon code highlighted, and that leads the person to click out faster and go to the shop and sell and purchase, that's in the interest of both of them. So, and from what we have, you in part you're right, but from what we have experienced, everything that helps get your email more of like in the eye of the user and have it be more relevant is also in the interest of the sender. So they are actually very interested in the highlighting or in the, like, let's just say at least in the having like having their emails marked up, for example, as this is an email that contains a coupon code, or this is an order email which belongs to these other 3 order emails. So that's something it is of interest.
Okay, I think we're going to need to sit down over beer for this sometime. Jim, your time.
Maybe water.
Hi. Indeed, yeah. This is Jim Fenton. So 2 quick comments. Your example of the sort of shipping status thing, I currently, when somebody ships something to me, they usually give me like a link to, we shipped your thing. If you want more detailed status, click this link. We can say, maybe it's not a good idea to be clicking links in email, but I think that ship has sailed. I'm kind of wondering about if that's the example of usage, if there's a huge advantage here over doing it in this way versus just redirecting the user to something, they probably already have a browser up anyway. And then before I sit down, the other comment had to do with use of DKIM, and yeah, spammers and everybody else signs everything with DKIM anyway. So, you can't just use the presence or absence of DKIM to determine whether or not the sender is reliable.
Correct.
Okay, Wes?
Wes Hardiker, ISI, IAB, and ICANN board, not speaking with any of my hats. So I'll give an optimistic statement. I want this. Looks highly useful. My pessimistic statement is along the same lines as Barry, so I actually put myself in line to say almost the same thing. But here's an example, right? Between market forces that tussle with who gets to display content, receivers versus senders, we already have a very well-known use case of web pages not wanting to do basic auth because they want to control the username and password dialog to put their branding on it. And so I do see in the long run, this potential, I can see people using it in the beginning and then starting to actually bring down their usage because they really want to put their brand on, the resulting itinerary for a flight or whatever it might be. So I worry about that. Having said that, this actually looks really useful from my point of view, and I'd like to use tools that support it. But I do worry that major senders that are gigantic brands want to, do market lock-in without being able to send this data.
Okay, I'll just point out we've closed the queue after Bron. Q?
Hi, Q Mysel. You mentioned the way you're implementing security and your current implementation is an explicit allow list of senders. This doesn't seem like an option that will scale to me as, as a hypothetical web shop owner of, a small coffee shop or something. I'm not going to go to every email sender and say, hi, please add my domain name to your allow list. That would take weeks at best, and it's not something anyone really has time for, or even if they have the time, they're not going to want to do it. So what other suggestions do you have? Because I'm not quite sure of how this could work, but I'm open to other ideas for how this might work.
We don't, to be really frank, we don't have any idea yet either. I guess it's a problem we face once adoption gets higher. For now, it is a viable solution, but it is similar to the spam detection, right? As someone else mentioned before, DKIM, spammers sign their emails with DKIM as well. So distinguishing, I guess it could eventually end up with, as long as we don't detect it as spam and it's DKIM signed, then we'll just do it. But we don't know yet.
I mean, yeah, so mail providers do already classify email as spam or not spam based on various things. So I guess user feedback from email clients like this was not a useful structured data would be perhaps one way to do that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Mike Bishop.
Mike Bishop, I was just going to comment on the companies wouldn't use this because they want to control things. If you look at several surfaces where emails get surfaced currently that they don't control, so for example, the message preview in the list or the pop-up notification when an email comes in on a device, this could be oriented as this allows the sender of an email to control the preview and what goes there in the same way that the Twitter card gives you control over the preview link for something that just a Twitter URL otherwise.
Yeah,
Thanks.
agreed.
Ron?
Thanks, Mike. That's a really good point. And yeah, I can absolutely see that as being something that people would use. I wanted to respond to the idea that companies didn't use, websites didn't use basic auth because they wanted to control the branding. That's not my experience of it. Mostly websites didn't want to use basic auth because the logout story didn't exist and because basic auth allowed absolutely no information rather than just not branding. It was a really poor user experience, and that's why people didn't do things. And certainly we want to make this not a poor user experience. Regarding the small coffee shop, certainly the way Fastmail does show images in email, remote images, is basically if it's in your address book. So add to address book gets you that. I think you could quite easily display this email contains structured data. Do you want to trust them? In the same way we have a button that says show images for this email or continue to show images for this sender. You'd have continue to show structured data for this sender per user, and certainly the larger mailbox providers would learn that behavior over time. We have answers for this kind of thing in a bunch of other areas for trust in email and distributed shared databases between providers. Something like that would happen. And yeah, the default would be don't display for things that you find questionable and let the user choose to display it. I think that's a fairly standard approach. As we use everywhere.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, Hernani, the next one is, we need to change slides. The next one is talking about PEP.
Okay, does this work? Yes. So I'm Hernani from the PEP Foundation. Okay, like this. Oops. Oh, or just take it like this, it's easy, okay. Okay, so next slide. So the motivation about this project, without going too much into the details, is to automate encryption with opportunistic security approaches, because we believe that the already existing tools are not well adopted by the user base. So let's say GNU-PG and stuff like that already exists. We also have our own PGP implementation called Sequoia PGP, written in Rust, which is being also adopted by Red Hat recently. But people usually are not able to use these tools by themselves. Also, if you look at, for example, the integrated mode in Thunderbird, you need to do some manual steps to start encrypting, and I think most people are lost with that. So it must go more in the direction of the instant messengers, we believe, but without this massive centralization which is going on. So yeah, I would agree with Hans-Jörg in the point that we need to somehow preserve these decentralized systems, perhaps even go further with peer-to-peer systems, but that's another story. In any case, our protocols are done in a way that they are not dependent on email in the end. So there were also other projects, and there are also other projects to automate, for example, financial transactions in banks, or to automate, for example, Talks chat and stuff like that. So it's all about automatic key management and identity management in the end. And for all this automation, we need, like, let's say, structured emails. Let's go to the use cases perhaps. So a very easy use case would be like that we just attach the public key always to the emails, unless you say you don't want to have that. You can also disable everything, of course, but by default we just do that. There's also a draft explaining that. And yeah, an obvious problem is, and I observed that already myself in practice, is that, for example, doctors or insurance clerks reply like, I tried to open the attachment, I cannot read what you want to say to me and stuff like that. So so there perhaps it would be good to have a way to not show attachments to ordinary users if we are talking about OpenPGP public keys. if there is not a setup for that, or that you show some symbol or something to indicate there is something there, but you need to do something. Perhaps, I think you proposed, Hans-Jörg, that you could, for example, propose to install some software to deal with that. Of course, that's a user experience question. Again, if this is IETF or not is to be discussed. I think there are different opinions here, but in any case, there is a problem, and it's not just PEP doing that. Also, if you set up Thunderbird with the integrated RMP-based PGP mode, also their keys are attached automatically, and there are also other commercial PGP products doing the same. There, of course, are also other projects like AutoCrypt, which put the keys into the header. This has, of course, the advantage that it's not invasive, but the disadvantage that you cannot import the key easily manually if you know what you're doing. So, yeah, so there are different approaches here. In any case, we do it like this, and this can, of course, lead to confusion. So we would perhaps like to have a mechanism to say, don't show to the user if there's no PGP setup. Okay, next use case. What we also have is if you have like a multi-device setup, which is, I think, usual nowadays. You have a cell phone, let's say iPhone, and the Thunderbird installation, and use the same mailbox, then you want to perhaps have the possibility to read all your messages on both devices. We have a quite complex protocol here where there is device discovering going on. I mean, there's just a device sending a beacon message to the inbox. So or both of them do that, and the first one who does that, makes like a start, and the second device reads from the inbox and sees, there is something, and then a complicated process starts with lots of messages, technical messages going on. So we also defined the state machine for that, and what PEP does. So if you have PEP on both devices using this inbox, it deletes, of course, these technical messages so that they are not displayed, and also puts them into a folder, which we call PEP, but it can still happen that they somehow show up, or that you cannot create the PEP folder. We also saw that in practice, that if you have some specific email providers, they don't allow you to just create folders automatically to put in technical messages. So there, it would perhaps also be nice to have a way to just say, these are just messages not to be consumed by a user. We also have an own header there, where we say auto-consume, yes, and stuff like that, as an X header, but it's just like our own stuff. So perhaps there are other projects who also would like to have, for example, such an header, which make clear that this is not to be consumed by user, but to be consumed automatically by some system reading these messages. That's like the key sync thing. I mean, if you want to see how such messages look, if you click at the slides in the end, there are like examples. But I don't think we should go into PEP details in this session here. So use case 3. Okay, no, this is like still use case. So here you just see these green things, these green arrows indicate messages going around, where it's about this to discover the devices on the same mailbox, then to do negotiation requests. And in the end, when you have a trusted channel to synchronize secret keys and everything. So it goes beyond this small intervention here to explain how this works, but you can look it up. And we also have like a session later this evening. I sent to the attendees mailing list. If you want to know more about it, you can just join there. What we also have is a protocol we call key reset. There, the idea is, you can just define, for example, that after a year, you should change the public key and inform the peers with which you are interacting that this was done. So that means you send them an automatic message out with a new public key and a revocation certificate. You can also do that more aggressively, for example, in zero trust environments. So, for example, the US government is propagating to do everything in zero trust ways. There is a Biden directive for that, for example, since May 2022. And the idea there, for example, is you just assume that there is an attacker inside the system. And if you know a box was taken, you just take it away, put in a new one. And if you have such a system in place, be it for email, be it for something else, then you can just continue to encrypt after the keys were distributed. And so, yeah, you can also define that you want to rotate more often than just once a year, depending on the threat model you, for example, have to just to make it less probable that an attacker can read all past communications. The key reset protocol is also important to have group communications in our system. So to have like managed groups or unmanaged groups. So managed groups would be you have an admin who can remove and add people. Unmanaged groups, it's just people form just a group and can leave, of course, this group. And if this happens, you need, of course, to make sure that there's a new group key and that not the old one is being used. And for all this stuff to happen, automatic messages need to be sent around. So we don't want the user to be intervening all the time here to import keys manually. So yeah, so there are lots of technical messages going around. And yeah, they shouldn't be shown to the user. So we come now to the requirement slide. I think, yes. Well, so the easy case, as mentioned, like attached keys, for example, shouldn't be shown, but there are also messages which shouldn't be shown at all. So these are like the two important parts. Yeah, and there can also be like things in between, like requirement number 3. So this is a little bit like our, so we have not like the proposition here which formats to use or whatever. We do strange things in our own formats, but just like our requirements would be more like to say it would be nice to have mechanisms to say certain things are not shown to a user or just partly shown to a user. This is like what we would like to have now for this part. Yeah. So I think this is like, yeah.
Okay, do we have any questions about this section before we move on to the standardization part? Okay, Mike?
Mike Bishop, I just wanted to say, I feel like these are good problems to solve, but it feels mostly disjoint from what we were talking about before. And I'm not sure if the solution space is the same.
Yeah, it's to be discussed. I mean, we think that we are also sending around like some kind of structured mails in that sense, but we need perhaps define what is part of that.
Yeah, there will be a later part of presentation talking about possible items to take, and some of them are kind of overlap, but yeah, the cryptographic properties might not be the right place for this work specifically, but some mechanism might be reusable or not. We'll find out, I suppose.
And the common thing is certainly that there is automation going on here. So there is like automatic processing of messages going on. I mean, what you heard before is more like taking content into some other context of the email client or even other applications like Google Mail does. And yeah, but I think still with the way that you still have something to display always. And in our case, you also, I mean, in the public key, in the case of public keys being attached, you should of course show the email to the user, but these other messages, use case 2 and 3, there is nothing to be shown basically. I mean, we also have in the emails, if you happen to see them, that it's written, this is a technical message, please ignore. So we are aware of the problem, but it's not nice to have such messages in your inbox if you happen to see them. So that's why we would like to have a mechanism here.
Hi, Joris Baum. When I looked at your key synchronization protocol, would it make sense, or could you provide some expertise maybe to the trust problem that was mentioned earlier? looks like you might have solved or might have similar issues or solved parts of it at least. I didn't understand it in full, but you seem to have established a trusted secure channel somehow. And then later on you do the synchronization. So maybe there's also relation between the trust problem mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so in short, what we do is the devices discover each other. They have independent key, secret public key pairs, of course, in the beginning. And with them, they can, of course, start to encrypt to themselves. And I mean, what you can do when you have an outside communication partner is that you have like fingerprints you can compare. In our case, we show natural language words, which we map from two fingerprints. And you can also do that internally. So if you have two devices, you can then say, okay, the words on the left are the same than on the right, like Bluetooth pairing to some extent. And then you have like a secure trusted channel, and through that you can send secret key material through your own mailbox. So it also, so that's why we do it in short. I said it now in short. It's of course a little bit more complicated to achieve that point. Yeah, in the end you have like a verified channel with verified public keys where you can be quite sure that it's a good idea. I mean, you can then exchange the secret keys. If you trust your device, of course. If they are hacked already, then you are lost anyways. But that's a general problem. Otherwise, there is this session this evening in room G301, 6:30. You can just join there and then we can look at it. I mean, there is like the draft and if there are ways to make the state machine, by the way, smaller, easier, we're also interested in that. We couldn't find any way to minimalize it somehow until now, but perhaps there is a way.
Okay, very quick comment, and then you're up again up front.
Yeah, I thought it's better to go in here. Thanks, Hanani. And I just wanted to briefly respond to Mike. So first of all, I think it's important to understand, like Hanani got to us after he saw the above, so we thought it might be a good, complementing thing in a way. Even one can discuss, of course, if it's exactly in the scope. However, I think it's if discussing that, there are two issues. So I think what Hanani put out here mainly is, I think, those issues which generally arise when you have automated emails, like, you don't want to, you want to have a good user experience, you want to have email clients be able to detect this is to be auto-processed and so on. So I think this is a clear similarity, and this is actually where all approaches like this suffer from. Even calendar invites by today do, because vendors do it very differently. Sometimes you have a strange calendar invite still in your calendar because something is strange there. But there is a second dimension, and this is also what I mentioned earlier. I think in this case of PEP, there is already an existing message format which has now been implemented. But if structured email or the schema.org-based email would have been in place already before you started PEP, you might have even used that for the actual, data in your emails, which you would send around. And so it might be easier to adopt or to write extensions for email clients or to adopt by email client vendors. I think this is two different facets which relate to each other.
Yeah, and by the way, something which also relates, I mean, despite synchronizing private keys, we are of course also interested to be able to synchronize contact and calendar data over this secure, trusted channel as soon as you establish it. And there it would also be nice to have a common way to do it, even if it's encrypted payload in the end. So we can do whatever you want inside that, of course, but still, there is like the ambitions are go beyond like secret keys to synchronize them.
Okay, thank you. Hans-Jörg, you're back for the next section. You have quite a lot of slides here. We're going to give you 20 minutes for this section, so we have enough time for discussion. So please,
all right.
Don't talk faster, just talk more efficiently.
All right. Well, yeah. So I've teased it earlier. So this later part of the presentation is not also something we strictly need to go to slide by slide in all detail. So maybe as an explanation. So as of now, there is not yet an RFC, obviously. So you see that on the data tracker page. Because also, this is a very quite early stage BOF. But of course, there is an idea of what such an RFC might contain. Yeah? So there is actually a list of issues that such RFCs might need to address. And the following presentation is basically putting together some of these issues in order to give you a more concrete idea in replacement for a draft you could read in order to understand a little bit more into detail what kind of issues would need to be solved within the IETF here. So said, I would probably not go into super detail in each of those cases, but I will just very briefly explain them, and we might probably, for common discussion, pick out afterwards the ones which somehow, somebody ring a bell with someone or something like that. That would be my proposal. And yeah, next slide. So overall, so how would we ideally, or what would be my idea probably to proceed with that after this BOF? So I think it's a good idea probably one would initially start with a very simple baseline, like not doing super fancy stuff, but more or less getting a framework which helps as many actors as possible to get a start in this area. And that would probably be around formalizing or standardizing the overall approach a little bit, extension to the internet message format. We will come to that in a minute. And thinking about these issues of trust, which to a certain extent, I think are maybe also among the most challenging and maybe also among those which haven't been thought about a lot yet. They will also be not so much in the next coming slides. But however, I think within the brainpower of the IETF, there would be solutions that could be found. I think it would be important, I stressed that before, to retain compatibility with what is already out there. So there is some ESPs, some senders which do already send structured data within emails. So I think it would be important that this isn't rendered useless by an approach to develop. And also some ISPs are already making use of it. Also that should still be working in the end. I also think, and we didn't touch that so far, and I think it's also way going beyond this BOF, but there is actually a lot of things one could talk about that go beyond that could work on top of that. Empowering users in addition to really make use of it to send structured mail, topics of discovery, like, is the recipient I want to send something to able to digest what I want to send as a structured email, aspects of dynamic mail. There's a lot of topics actually that could go beyond that, but I would render that out of scope for now. But if that is decided to be a worthwhile endeavor here by the crowd, I could easily think that this could be something worthwhile to follow up with later. But it won't be followed up right now in the next slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a list of issues which I want to go through. So no worries, I don't want to talk ages on each of those issues, I promise. Please also note these issues are sort of preliminary and incomplete. So even though there might be suggestions, this is not normative suggestions, this is more for illustration. So yeah, don't take everything too literal. This has not been yet widely discussed. It's more for giving you an idea of what things might need to be solved. Also, not every point is strictly important or needs to be solved. This is also a debate we probably might or might not do now. Yeah, probably my opinion would be let's use this more to judge or get an idea of relevancy of the overall problem scope, and not of each individual topic, which I'll mention in the next couple of minutes. Next slide, please. So first thing is, in the current implementation, like it is used by senders and ISPs, structured data attached to the email is within the text HTML part, and you can consider this a partial representation of the human readable message. So as just mentioned, I think there was a question from Barry. There is still the HTML part of the mail which is displayed besides, because one cannot be sure that the structured annotations give a complete account of what is conveyed in the HTML part of the message. However, I think this is a viable use case as well. Yeah, so there might be cases in which I want to completely describe the actual content of the human readable part, also for a machine interpretable version, maybe in the case of key exchange, for instance. So when the user isn't supposed to read anything or is only supposed to read the machine readable version if she decides to choose for that. And for this, I think there needs to be a way to distinguish for a client. This is like a partial representation like it's there right now, or this is actually a full representation of the content. And this is where we have multi-part alternative already. So one suggestion would be to allow also a multi-part alternative third part So not just text plain, text HTML, but also something like text JSON LD or text RDF HTML. I think next slide, that should be clear. Next thing is about which formats to support. So currently with the existing vendors, it's also not 100% clear if actually every vendor supports all of these formats. But for instance, for Gmail, it's clear they support both in the HTML email header JSON LD. So this is a small snippet you've been seeing before on the screenshot, but they also do support inline annotations on the HTML email. In 2 different formats actually, which means that clients actually need to support 3 different ways of extracting that information, which of course is a little bit of a burden for implementers. Question is, what would be a recommendation for a standardized version? Proposal would probably be to keep it like it is in a way, first of all for compatibility reasons. Also, it has been shown, I think Connie mentioned that 1&1 actually developed plugins for 4 different CMS or shopping systems. And if you look at these plugins, they also use different versions of this generation. So some use JSON LD, some use HTML microdata. And the very reason is that within these systems, the way they generate HTML content is just different. And so the extension points there wouldn't allow easily one or the other approach. So it just makes things easier for senders. And this is probably the rationale that should be having priority. But of course, open to discussion. It's just for illustrating points. Next slide, please. Next thing is about the vocabulary. So currently, vendors, like for instance, Gmail uses, I think, 6 to 8 types, depends on how you count. Out of those, what was it, like 700, I think, schema.org things. So all the other ones, I think Gmail says they might probably store it and maybe show it at some time in your Google search, but you won't see them directly typically in your Gmail. For Yahoo, I'm not 100% sure. For 1&1, I think Connie said they support basically 2 or 3 of them. So overall, the use cases are very limited by that. Yeah. So even though in schema.org there is, for instance, a representation of a music album, I cannot send you a Spotify song. Even though there is a concept in schema.org for location, I cannot send you a location currently to your Gmail account or something like that. So the question is, should this stick to schema.org, which also in a way it would be helpful, of course, to have some baseline here, but also I believe there should probably be a mechanism to allow for generic RDF. There is then a question, of course, again, like how will senders and receivers agree? Very complicated question, very long discussion. Probably nothing for now. Next slide, please. Relating structured data to message content. So the way it is currently, if you look at the plain message which you receive from a sender, which includes structured data, it basically doesn't tell you which part of the message this structured data applies to. Yeah? So that message could have multiple attachments, for instance. There could be multiple parts within the HTML content, and basically there is no way for you as a user or for the email client to say, okay, this is where that flight is, for instance. The only exception is if you use these inline HTML annotations, then of course the annotations are exactly in that HTML element. And so you have an idea probably as a client what this is, because the annotation is right at that place. And the advantage would of course be, sorry, that in that case you could do maybe some inline highlighting or something like that. Yeah? So have some UI features there in a way. And also, of course, it would be interesting probably to say, okay, this is actually a flight which was extracted or which describes what is in that PDF or something like that here attached. Also something not currently possible. So there are various options actually how something like this could be achieved. Just very shortly mentioning them. So obviously you could do something like multi-part related nesting. So you could allow for each and every attachment to have a multi-part related part where you wrap the attachment with a dedicated JSON ID file. Might get a quite complicated MIME tree and might be quite complicated for email clients. You could think about something like CID, MID, which we already have in RFCs for referencing message body parts or content IDs in a similar fashion. Don't want to go into detail. You could conversely or reversely also think about within the actual structured data referencing some HTML entities in the HTML email or some body message part identifiers. Complex discussion, not for now. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we are, Hernani. Obviously, sorry, there might be some cases where you would like to have the option to hide either complete emails or body parts. Here is an interesting point, and this is exactly what Hernani said. So some of the issues you come across here with structured email are actually issues that have been around already for other things, like encryption keys, like calendar invites, like inline images, and which I would say there is a certain gap in current implementations, which this again highlights in a way. And so this could also be a chance to reconcile some of the client behavior or to more clearly define it in those particular cases. Next slide, please. Sorry, Barry. No, didn't work. Oh, okay. Another thing Hernani mentioned, how do you deal actually with multiple user agents or email clients? My personal opinion, and I would be very interested to learn if there is other opinions in the crowd, is that in the design, while IMAP was designed actually for multi-client usage in a way, many of the email standards don't really address or take care of the fact that users might come into with various email clients. So if you think again about calendar invites, there is a plethora of actual implementations where the server side of the incoming system will already process the calendar invite for the built-in calendar, whereas you as a user might actually want to process that calendar invite with your favorite Thunderbird client. And it's very dependent on the environment you use and on the situation on how that works. It's not very transparent to users, and there is currently no standardized way to get that done in a meaningful fashion. Yeah, and we just heard about the case Hernani said. Actually, also an interesting question here is, which I know from practice very well, is throttling. Yeah? So in case your own email clients are not aware of each other, a typical email provider will allow you 12 IMAP threads experience-wise to use. Yeah? So we have many users which have multiple devices attached to their email provider, and with some devices, then occasionally they just get error messages and they have no idea why, because obviously all their clients are basically trying to fetch email. A migration might come on top or other third-party tool, and there is an issue here. Yeah? So again, I think this is a very general error space. There might be ideas of solving that here, probably with IMAP flags or with header fields. Up to discussion later on. Next slide, please. Message updates. Currently, when I send you a flight itinerary, and this is processed, for instance, in this KDE itinerary app, and your flight get canceled or something like that, unless you do something like an implementation with the airline to fetch the live data, there will be no way to revoke that data. Yeah? So even if I send another structured email with the very same flight, with a different boarding time or something like that, you cannot currently state that this actually overrides the prior message formally. Yeah? I mean, you could implement it in a way by whatever, comparing flight numbers or something like that and assuming this is actually updating. But this would be a hacky way of doing it right now. So once you start processing emails automatically, you might want to have a way to explicitly say this piece of structured data I sent by now is actually an update of structured data I sent before, or is even trying to delete that because whatever the flight got canceled or that was an erroneous message I sent. Again, something currently not possible. Again, there is actually things which exist already in the email space which are related. Many of you might know status messages you get from GitHub, from somewhere else. Every once in a while, somebody updates an issue, you get another status update. The issue was changed, the issue was changed, the issue was changed. There might be something like threading in your email client which helps you order that out a little bit. But it might also be nice, totally irrespective of structured email, if there would be a header field or something like that that says, okay, this status update of GitHub actually replaces all the ones before regarding this issue. So probably the email client can fold all these emails into one single email, maybe denote there were prior ones, but get rid of the status email flooding. Many of you know recalling messages. I think that's something primarily Outlook implements. You get these nice mails like somebody wants to recall that message because it was, you know, sent by accident. I think that fits in here also a little bit. And yeah, we just heard the example of encryption keys. Next slide, please. Responding to actions. So one thing I didn't mention yet is that schema.org for email actually has one tiny back channel already. And this is basically an HTTP post to confirm certain actions. So as an airline provider, for instance, you can actually, in your markup, which you send to your ISP, include a concept which is called confirm action with an HTTP URL. And ISPs might provide that with a small tiny button, excuse me, small tiny button within your email client, which allows you something like a one-click confirmation of, you know, you have seen that, or you want to take that flight, or whatever the displayed label is. That might remind some of you also about something like one-click unsubscribe for email lists, which sort of is also a little bit related to this overall topic in terms of, you know, trying to automate or make something more structured and interactive in terms of user interaction. So the point now is I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people are, of course, very hesitant to say, okay, whoa, should I really implement something like an HTTP call a user can make out of my email client for privacy purposes, la 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 la. Also, you can argue this is a little bit like conceptually diverse now. You know, I get a structured email, but I respond by an HTTP post request. Why wouldn't I just also respond with a structured email in a similar way I do with a message delivery notification? So proposal here would be always an IMAP response. So proposal would be here to probably offer or allow for an alternate mechanism as well, which uses structured email as a sender. Next slide, please. Efficient processing. So those of you who have been implementing user-side email processing stuff, maybe also partially server-side, know it's quite resource-consuming to process large email. This is why many vendors cache, especially headers in databases, something like that, to make something like, you know, delivering headers to mobile devices, to email clients more efficient. Problem is now with structured data, especially if it's embedded in the text HTML part. You don't know if there's structured data inside unless you really look into that email. Yeah. So question is, in order for implementation, might it be interesting to actually add a header field or something like that, signaling there is actually structured data within here, so that clients can just need to actually run a parsing algorithm on these particular mails in order to extract the data. Again, actually, there is other problems which are related in the email world already. An interesting one is attachment processing. So, you know, usually you have the same issue if you want as an email client to display here's an attachment within that email, because in order to know that, you basically need to analyze the MIME body structure. So I think this was discussed on IETF mailing lists. I think this has not been done as an RFC, but I was too lazy to look it up before, but there is this has attachments flag. So the way it's currently solved, and I think, for instance, DAFCAT does implement it, probably that was even proposed by DAFCAT, is that if the DAFCAT initially receives the mail, and so it's in the memory anyway, it will apply a flag, an IMAP flag called has attachment to that message. And so any further downstream processing can leverage this flag and more efficiently, therefore, be aware that there is an attachment inside. Next slide, please. Data extraction. So we had that topic before. Connie mentioned it. Some vendors do extract data from emails that do not have structured data yet. What do? They actually put this into their legacy databases. From this legacy databases, they basically display it in the legacy tools. So structured data, which one-on-one, for instance, has been extracted by machine learning from emails, will thus not be available currently if you access this with an open client like Thunderbird. So wouldn't it be nice also to have a way of accessing that data or giving that data, which was once extracted, to other clients than just the proprietary clients of the ISP? Again, many ways this could be done. There could be, which is actually even missing here, there could be a dedicated storage for that. So in parallel to the IMAP storage, there could be something like a graph storage, which such an enabled email server would offer. You could put that into the email body content, modifying it, which is probably debatable. I don't know. You could have another storage format somehow. You could probably also try, I would have to look into more detail into something like RC5257, IMAP annotate for this, even though I think it's not widely supported yet. Maybe it could be a booster to get support for that. Next slide, please. All right, well, we did all the slides. Were there some particular points people would like to discuss or have questions to? I hope I was not too fast, but I hope I got you an idea what kind of challenges are there. And, you know, I also hope it was sort of clear why I think some of these challenges at least would be helpful to be solved, not just for structured email, but we have been obviously seeing that some of these overlap actually with very different use cases like the ones Hernani had presented. Wes.
Okay, Wes.
Wes Herdiger, ISI. Wow, long list. So the obvious process question would be, if this becomes a working group forming, you know, type of scenario in the future, how do we write a charter that's a little more limited in scope than everything you just presented, right? Or, you know, I assume that not all of these problems need to be handled at once with respect to actually standardizing something. So, you know, this isn't so much a question as, you know, this is something that I think we'd have to think about it, distilling your slides into, you know, what's step 1, step 2, and step 3 for a working group to charter a couple of times.
Yeah, I think we would definitely need to prioritize if we did that.
Even though, if I'm allowed a short comment, those, I mean, I would even say some of these issues were maybe tiny. Maybe they require discussion. Okay, maybe I have not the experience to really judge how long the discussion will take. So I appreciate that feedback. But yeah, I think those issues certainly I see as manageable in a certain way. Yeah.
DKG.
Hi.
Hi.
So I agree with Wes. This clearly needs a lot of prioritization. I'm wondering what you imagine as the testing process for new proposals that come through here, or for even non-new proposals, right? We need to do interop testing if we want to convince people that the work that we're doing is functional. Do you know of anybody who has like a fleet of mail user agents that we can just jam messages at and see what they do with them, and how we could evaluate them as to whether or not they support it?
That's a very good question. If I got you correctly, please stay a little bit at the mic to clarify if I got it wrong. So the question is, if I got it right, how to test this? Yeah. So how can we ensure actually something we develop will really work out? How can we see it somehow? And this is actually a problem right now. So I told you for senders, it's really difficult to test with the current ISPs, and also Connie told that to see what happens. Yeah. There are some cases it's not verified, but I heard that, you know, some vendors might only show certain markup in certain regions. So with like accounts which are created in certain regions, which obviously is sort of really tricky to figure out as a sender. However, I do in this case, I mean, the IETF is based on running code, is based on reference implementations. So, I mean, I've been discussing, for instance, with the KDE people. I think they have also been writing on the email list from which the KDE itinerary plugin is here. And they also do have an open implementation in Kmail, which is a standard email client of KDE, which already displays sort of this. And there's also implementation within Nextcloud. And also we as Odriga are doing open source reference implementations here, and we want to actually collaborate with Nextcloud, for instance, and also with the KDE people to have a shared, you know, probably pre-processing things that could be reused within those clients. I think there was also Mark Laporte from Swift Wikisuite on the mailing list who's interested in that. So I'm actually pretty optimistic that there will be an open sourcey way of being able to this. However, since I think the IETF is not mainly concerned with user experience to a large extent, there will be limits with respect to that. Yeah, so obviously there is no way to test how Gmail does this or leverages this in their product suite. But this is obviously clear, I think.
So I just, as we think about whether we want to declare a given spec within something like this to be functional, if we get a working group, we say, okay, we're advancing this. I think it may not be what IETF has done traditionally, but we should be thinking about how we can actually verify that these things are functional.
Right.
And I'm fully with you on having free and open source software implementations.
Mhm.
But if there's a way that we can tell even proprietary vendors, hey, here are some messages that have this thing, here's how you can record what your user agent does, we can, that we can evaluate. It's something that we ought to be thinking about. And I know that's not traditional IETF work, but if we want to say that these things function so that people who want to send can generate them with confidence, we need to be thinking about how to do that.
I agree with that. I appreciate your suggestion on this, and it would be great if you could follow up on this later on the list, or if we could probably think about that in more detail.
DKG, maybe we'll try to organize some hackathon meetups and try to, use it as a checkpoint and try to get people's attention.
Okay, so I'm Vittorio Bertola, and speaking as an MUI vendor, I think that, I cannot commit yet because I have to discuss internally, but I think that there is interest in MUI vendors in this. So I also agree that, especially given the long list, which is really scary, the way you showed it, we do need some prioritization and maybe identifying one or two MVPs or use cases that should be tackled first. And maybe with that in mind, we could reach out to at least some of the big MUI makers and make sure that they are in the loop. So maybe the next step could also be some outreach in places like Moog or other email organizations to inform people that this effort is starting and seeing whether there's interest. And this could be the next step. So between now and San Francisco IETF to determine whether there's actually the willingness. But I do think that many MUI makers have the concern that they're getting more and more of this kind of sort of structured information in multiple ways, and it might be easier for them to actually make a good product if they have a standard way to detect what's going on.
Thanks. So just with respect to your suggestion, I think it's very much useful to engage also with other potentially interested bodies like Morg. So for instance, at the recent Morg in San Francisco, I already gave a lightning talk on this to actually advertise this BOF session, and there's certainly the idea to continue this kind of conversation. There is actually also an ongoing working group within Morg on dynamic email content security issues, which is overlapping a little bit with some of the points here. So yes, that's totally makes sense also in terms of getting vendors on board.
Okay. So what I wanted to check now, is everybody clear on the problem statement, the use cases, the things that that need to get done to standardize this? Any further discussion, questions, uncertainty? Okay, seeing nothing pop up quickly. John Clenson.
If your question is everyone clear? I am not clear. I am somewhat confused by the speed and densities of these presentations. I saw some things go by which were stated as matters of fact, which I think are controversial, which is another kind of not clarity. So I'm not knowledgeable enough at this point to be able to be opposed, nor am I able to be enthusiastically supportive. But if you're asking me if I'm clear, the answer to that is definitely no.
Okay, good. That's what I was probing for. So there's still a need to pursue the discussion and get more clarity on where we want to proceed, not just how we want to proceed. Okay. Alexei has something to.
Yeah, I suppose I would like to, to ask a more generic question. Do people think there is something in this set of proposed problems to solve that people would like to work on. And maybe we can do a show of hands of some kind.
Okay, well, let's take Christopher first and see where we.
Chris Anasio, I feel like the list of problems was huge, but I don't see anything that's particularly enlightening in the document as to what the scope of what it would be is. And so your comment of, is it clear what we would work on? No, it's not, because right now it feels like what we would work on is boiling the ocean. And
Do you see things in here, as more to Alexei's question, do you see pieces of this that you would be interested in working on?
potentially.
Okay. Thank you. Daniel?
I think the pieces that would be the most useful for a working group to work on are questions about the preferred format, location within email, reference to other parts of email, these sort of meta considerations. And I think a charter that focused specifically on that and had one use case, one specific structured data use case, and the creation of a registry with that one entry in it would be a way to avoid boiling the ocean. The one use case gives us a chance to verify that the placement and references and those sorts of things are working. But if we start with a charter that says, and I want to know when my pizza is going to be ready, we're never going to get anything concrete.
Okay, and I saw Christopher putting his thumb up for that.
I haven't really discussed this with Barry or anybody, but maybe my suggestion is there should be some possible drafts to write, because a lot of the discussions we had in the chat as well was people might agree on specific thing to work on, but they start disagreeing a lot about specific solution. So maybe we have some more concrete examples how this might look like. Might be also helpful to narrow it down a little bit.
Sorry, one other comment about the way this works. So earlier in your talk, you mentioned that there are multiple different formats, and you were inclined to say, let's leave multiple formats because it makes it easier for the senders to use whatever format they have handy. I think that is completely backwards. This is not a reflection on you. The ecosystem tends to do this. The IETF, we tend to do this. It drives me nuts. We should be specifying one good way to do it, because if you do one good way, then the generators will say, oh, well, I might as well use that one good way. And we don't have to worry about the diversity of all of the receivers. The receivers all have one must implement. Then why would you implement anything else as the sender? So let's try to not have 5 different ways to do it.
I like that point, yes. Ted, your hand went up and then back down. Did you want to say anything? Ah, okay. Okay, so I guess the final thing, who thinks that there's nothing to work on here? Raise your hand. Okay, I see no hands, so that's good. Who thinks the right answer to proceeding is continued discussion on the list and perhaps another BOF in San Francisco? Got a couple of hands for that. Yeah, and one half hand here, whatever. Connie.
Just raising my hand.
Okay, great. And who thinks that there is a different way forward that you would like to see? And then please get up to the microphone and tell us what that is. Daniel.
I would like to see a concrete charter that's narrowly scoped, at least as narrow. I mean, what I described, I think, was not particularly narrow, but still narrower than the huge laundry list here. I'd like to see a specific charter. I'd like to see us work towards forming a working group.
So do you think?
I think there's work to do here, and I think we should have a working group to do it. I don't think it belongs in another working group necessarily.
So you think the right path is to work on a charter before San Francisco rather than having another BOF?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Work on it over the mailing list.
Right. Thank
We
you,
have
Ted.
email clients.
Ted Hardy. I think I kind of agree with DKG, but primarily because what we really need is a scope. And the point of the charter in this case is to narrow the scope to something that isn't boiling the ocean and has an audience. So I think if you come up with a discussion that says, here's the narrow scope, and here are the people who have agreed that if implemented, they would deploy it, and the other people who've agreed that if specified, they will implement it, then you're well on your way. But I think the question the chair's asked a moment ago, is there work here? Yeah, it's the ocean. There are lots of fish. The problem is picking which one you're going to try and catch, because some of them are going to be near shore and some are pelagic and some of them just out of your reach. And I think this discussion, especially this last section, had so many different things in it that any working group that tried to tackle it would not ever complete. And that's not success, even if you get a few things done along the way. So I think realistically, I don't care if you have milestones. I don't care if you have the pretty bits of a charter. If you come to San Francisco with a narrow scope, a set of people who said they implemented if specified, and a set of people that would deploy it if implemented, then I think you're done. But if you come to San Francisco with a laundry list of this size, I think we'll continue to worry about boiling the ocean.
Okay, thanks, Ted. So we're looking at perhaps a working group forming BOF in San Francisco is the sense here. I have 3 people in the queue and I have 0 minutes left. So I'll let the 3 of you make very brief comments. John.
My comment is made much easier about what Ted just said, because I agree with him 100%. The only thing I would add would be to try to set a target on getting that charter or scope statement or whatever it is together at least 6 weeks out from the San Francisco meeting, so we can make decisions at that point as to whether we want a WG forming BOF or something else or whatever. But I think Ted's comments exactly cover the issues, except that I would have added some of the fish you might try to catch are carnivorous.
Thanks, John. Wes?
Wes Herdeker, ASI, all working group forming BOFs should have a charter coming, along with the working group forming BOF. I think that the translation of the last 3 people is expect a longer time slot to discuss the charter in San Francisco, and because there's going to be a discussion around it, and don't do 15 minutes at the end. That's not going to be enough.
Yeah, agreed. Q, you got the last
Q
word.
Marshall. I think I agree generally with what everyone has said so far. There seems to be a well-defined problem here. Well, maybe not particularly well-defined, but a good problem has been identified, and I think work now needs to be done on figuring out, okay, exactly how are we going to tackle, what are we going to tackle here, instead of, because this is something that's already implemented by many mail user agents. So there's clearly, that would be, I think, a good place to start. Can we try and standardize what is already out there and go from there?
Okay, thanks. We are out of time. It's lunchtime.
Thank you.
So thanks everybody for coming here, making your comments, and we will look forward to more discussion on the mailing list and a proposed charter at some point.
Thanks to the chairs and thanks to everybody participating in discussion. Appreciate it.